Well, hello there. It's great to see you. Welcome to another edition of the Ezra File. First one in a little while. So, why have I come back to the Ezra File? Well, we've come back to the Ezra File. I'd like to talk to you about something that I saw, a little clip that I saw on Twitter over the Christmas period, or X, or whatever it is that Elon Musk calls it these days. But on Twitter, I saw this little clip. It was a clip of a scene in a shopping mall, a shopping centre, shopping precinct. And what it was in the foreground, it was a scene of little children coming to Father Christmas, little children in Santa's grotto, if you like. And as this was being played out, in the background, suddenly there appeared a bunch of guys waving Palestinian flags and shouting, Jesus was a Palestinian, Jesus was a Palestinian, Jesus was a Palestinian. And this caught my attention. That it began my thinking. Jesus was a Palestinian, and it took me back. That little clip on Twitter took me back to this book here. It's a book, as you can see. It's called "Who Was Jesus," written by a guy called N.T. Wright. It was a book that I read as part of my preparation to go to theological college, part of my preparation for theological study and training that you do at theological college. And N.T. Wright, as it happened, went to the same theological college as I do. I did rather. So it was more or less compulsory reading. Anyway, who was Jesus? What's it about? Well, this book basically tells the story of 19th century German theology. Now, that to you might sound a little bit niche. 19th century German theology. What's that got to do with me, eh? Well, it turns out quite a lot. 19th century German theology turns out to have been incredibly influential, not just in Germany, but also in England as well, or the English-speaking world. Not just in the 19th century, but also in the 20th century. And 19th century German theology actually goes beyond just the church. It goes beyond just English-speaking theology. 19th century German theology has seeped its way, diffused its way into society, into the English-speaking world generally. And it's actually been incredibly influential. It's formed people's basic ideas of the Bible, of Jesus, of God. Even people who have never heard the term 19th century German theology. Actually, the people on the street today, they will almost certainly have been influenced by it and its themes and its emphases. So 19th century German theology is actually incredibly influential, even in 21st century Britain. So what's the story? What is it about? Well, 19th century German theology. Before we go to that, we have to go back a century to the 18th century, to a guy called Gotthold Lessing. Gotthold Lessing was an 18th century German thinker and theologian, and he's famous in theological circles. Okay, then, not very famous, but he's famous for a little phrase, and the phrase is like this. The phrase is, between history and theology is a big, ugly ditch. Between history and theology is a big, ugly ditch. Actually, he said something rather more flowery than that. He said this. He said, the accidental happenings of history cannot form the basis for the necessary truths of reason. But anyway, let's stick with a big, ugly ditch, eh? What he did, what Lessing did, is he looked at the New Testament. He looked at, in particular, at the four Gospels. And he said, it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen like that. In fact, he said more than that. He said it couldn't happen like that. It couldn't be like that. And so Lessing's ideas in the 18th century took hold in the 19th century. And what Tom Wright does, he tells you the story of 19th century German theology. He tells you about people, guys like Hermann Reimarus. He tells you about people like David Strauss, not the composer, David Strauss, who was a German theologian. And Strauss said, basically, what you've got in the New Testament. It's not history. It's not events that happened. It's mythology. It's a reading back. It's the church's theology, the church's worship, reading back onto the life of the historical Jesus. It didn't happen that way because there's a big ugly ditch between theology, between worship, between the church's teaching, and events that actually happened. Jesus wasn't really the kind of person that you saw, that you read about in the pages of the New Testament, and that became successive waves of German theology through the 19th century was taken up in that kind of vein. And another person that Tom Wright talks about is a guy called Adolf Harnack, or Adolf von Harnack, as we should properly call him. Harnack said, okay, that's fine. Okay, so maybe history and theology, there's a gap between the two of them. But actually what we can do is we can reconstruct what Jesus was actually like. Maybe it wasn't like that exactly. Maybe, this might be a little bit mythological. But actually what we can do is we can reconstruct what Jesus was actually like. And he used a very vivid image of an onion. An onion, if you can peel off the Gospels, like an onion, you can peel off the outer layers. You can peel off all the unhistorical stuff, all the theology that accrued around it. You can peel it away. And in the middle, you kind of have the kernel. You have the bit right at the middle. And that is the bit that was historical. That's the bit that tells us what Jesus was really like. And Adolf Harnack said you can do it. You can strip away the layers in the New Testament, in the four Gospels, and you can get back to what Jesus was actually like. And again, after Harnack, successive waves of German theologians tried to reconstruct the figure of what Jesus was actually really like. But there was a problem. And the problem was identified by a guy in here that he talks about. There's a guy called Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer, he was a thinker, he was a theological thinker, but Schweitzer was also a doctor, he's a medical doctor. And Schweitzer's famous because of his work in Africa. He was, in essence, a medical missionary in Africa for a number of years. He set up hospitals and clinics and things in Africa, I think West Africa off the top of my head. But anyway, he devoted his life to try and improve the human condition, if you will. And Schweitzer said this, that all these people who were trying to reconstruct the person, what he was really like, what's called the historical Jesus, what he was really like. So all those people who have tried to do that, what they're doing is that, and again he uses another vivid image, he said what they're doing is they're looking down the well of history. And as they look down the well of history, all they're seeing is their own reflection that comes back at them. You look down the well of history and all you see is your own reflection coming back at you. In other words, what Schweitzer said was happening is that all these 19th century German theologians are really only constructing Jesus in their own image. And as I saw that clip on Twitter and I heard the chanting, Jesus was a Palestinian, Jesus was a Palestinian, Jesus was a Palestinian. And I thought, actually, that's what these people are doing. They are doing exactly what 19th century German theology did. They are attempting to reconstruct Jesus. They are looking down the well of history, and all that they're finding is a reflection of their own image. They're trying to reconstitute, reconfigure, reconstruct the person of Jesus, but they're reconstructing him in terms of their own image, the image taken from the politics of the contemporary Middle East. So who was Jesus? What was he really like? Does the real Jesus, the guy who walked down the street in Nazareth, who fixed your broken chair, who put your shelves up, who built your extension, does that real historical Jesus bear any relationship to the Jesus of the church's worship and the Jesus of the church's teaching? And I spent a good deal of time at theological college thinking through that question. And the conclusion I came to is that the real Jesus is actually here. Here he is. He's in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. The Jesus who walked down the street in Nazareth, who fixed your shelves, who built your extension, is the Jesus who is in here. The Jesus of history is the Christ of the church's worship and the church's faith. And if you want to know the real Jesus, well, here's where you find him. You find him in the pages of the New Testament. You find him in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And if you don't find the real Jesus, then you will end up constructing a false Jesus. You will end up doing what 19th century German theology did. You will reconstruct him in your own image. So if you want to know who the real Jesus is, if you want to know what he means, if you want to know what he means to you today, here's the place you need to go. This tells you who Jesus actually is. Be seeing you.